So how much of a problem is cheating for Warhammer 40K? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy and game focused 40k channel, where today we're trying to address the thorny topic of cheating. In general, I don't think it's the biggest issue to face the hobby. The vast majority of people don't really mind too much whether they win or lose a game of model soldiers, but I think it's still worth being aware of, as it can be something that can make games a lot less fun, and perhaps just be ready to challenge it if it does rear its head. In this video we'll just talk about some of the ways that people might cheat in Warhammer 40k, and if someone is cheating, how best to try and handle it. So first up, I've often seen Warhammer 40k described as a gentleman's game, this meaning that there's a certain expectation for both players not to bend and twist every rule to every advantage, and I think it certainly works a lot better if both players are playing politely and treating each other how they'd want to be treated, rather than trying to twist or break the rules at every opportunity. Compared with more simple games, say for example chess, 40k has an absolutely enormous rule set spread across many publications and FAQs. Even the best players in the whole game won't know the entire rule set, and it does require both players to be honest about their own rules, as each player might not know the full extent of every codex. There's also quite a lot of scope for ambiguity within 40k. Every turn requires units to interact with each other in quite a lot of very specific ways. Even fudging measurements to a small amount can make a very big difference for whether a squad, say, can shoot a unit or charge a unit. The sequencing of the turn phases can be really quite punishing if you get it wrong. And despite Games Workshop producing a far tighter rule set over 8th and 9th edition than there was before, there are still a fair few situations that need a certain amount of interpretation. Say exactly how you're going to play each bit of terrain in the game, or how you're allowed to field models in the army, say for example not modelling for advantage. Overall, I think it's just very hard to stop someone intent on abusing every single step in the game, and it can mean that cheating in any one game isn't actually the hardest thing to do. Obviously, it's a really bad idea for the hobby. It'll certainly damage people's enjoyment of the game if they realise that they're being cheated, and it's probably not going to wind up as a good thing for the player who's doing the cheating either, whether it means that you get a bad rep within a gaming group, or you attract a lot of negative press on social media by cheating at a high-profile event. That's certainly been known to happen in the past. There's quite a few ways that you could subdivide cheating in 40k. People often like to talk about it in terms of hard cheating or soft cheating. Hard cheating would be things like just outright lying about the rules. Sometimes the technicalities of a warlord trait or relic, for example, can be really quite big in terms of how well they interact with the other army, and even a subtle change could make it far more powerful. Other things could be just like remembering the stats wrong for models, or using the wrong casting value for a psychic power. Again, this can be kind of easy to get away with just with the sheer scope of rules in 40k. Mistakes are generally going to be common as people get to know an army, so it can be really hard to say whether the other player has just literally deliberately made that up, or they have made a genuine error. There's a fair bit of plausible deniability. I've certainly heard of some cases of weighted dice, though I've never seen it before myself. I imagine if they're rolling a whole load of dice all game long it wouldn't be that hard to catch, but I could imagine if they just had one or two sprinkled in that they used for key rolls, it might not be the easiest to pick up on. I have seen at least one case of someone trying to use sleight of hands to get an advantage, in particular picking up one dice more every time they made a roll in a way that was really quite hard to challenge as they hid the roll under their hands. There could be potential for other things such as manipulating card decks, or moving models when people aren't looking. Naturally, taking an illegal army list is going to be an easy way to gain an advantage, though of course that would be quickly picked up on if anyone did any sort of scrutiny of the list itself. And perhaps one of the most important ones is keeping score incorrectly, as I guess if you're going to deliberately cheat on anything, then the endgame score is possibly the most powerful thing to cheat on. As sort of the other side of hard cheating, there's what people tend to call soft cheating, which while still being pretty problematic, is where every mistake could be plausibly denied if it was put under more scrutiny. Say like with those rules errors, if they just happen to make a whole load of rules errors that happen to be in their favour. Not bothering to be too precise about measurements, maybe moving an extra half an inch or an inch with every unit every time they do it. And perhaps things like slow play at tournaments, which I guess the stereotypical one from 8th edition might be, say, if you ran a massive horde of models, and then you moved on to all the objectives, and then play so slowly with the horde of models that you're playing, that you only get to turn 2 or turn 3, so you win because your opponent has had no chance to clear you off. Again, I wouldn't say it's massively common or anything, but it is one of the driving forces why some events decided to roll out chess clocks, just to prevent that happening. I would stress though that while genuine cheating does go on, I think genuine accidental mistakes are far more common than that. 40k is a very complicated game, everyone does make mistakes at one time or another, and I'd really try not to attribute things to malice where not justified. As a category outside of cheating though, I'd say that poor sportsmanship is certainly worth a mention, as it's also something that can be fairly unpleasant, and it does have the potential to give one player some advantages in game. Things like perhaps disproportionately punishing sequencing errors, like for example one player shoots one gun in the shooting phase before realizing that they should have been doing their psychic powers. I think it would generally be quite poor sportsmanship not to allow them to go back and do their psychic phase, unless it was obvious in some way that they were trying to play out of sequence for getting their own advantage. There's nothing in the rules that says that you have to go back and allow the other player to do that phase again, but for me that would be disproportionately punishing. I think it's also quite polite to talk through some of the particularly obvious gotcha moments in your army before the game as well, particularly if your opponent isn't familiar with the army at all. Obviously you can't talk through every single rule or stratagem and exactly how you're going to play them, but just mentioning things like, yes, these guys can do a surprise heroic intervention move if you leave units within 3 inches of them, so if people make the mistake later in the game, then they can't say that they haven't been warned. To be honest, poor sportsmanship is a topic all in itself. There's all other sorts of things such as list tailoring or setting up favourable terrain to your army, none of which is outright cheating, but still perhaps not the nicest behaviour that might well decide a game in ways other than who's commanding the best army or who's thought up the best army list. So before we talk about confronting cheaters, I thought it would be worth talking about how common it is in 40k. Obviously this is going to vary pretty massively depending on what sort of group you're playing with, and quite possibly around the world as well, but at least here in the UK I can't say that I've come across it very commonly at all. At least anecdotally, I feel like the 40k player base has matured really quite a lot over the last several years, maybe going from a bit more of a childish mentality of it being all-consumingly important how well your model soldiers perform on the tabletop, to maybe having a bit more of a mature mindset that it's a game, you're going to win some and lose some, and in reality you're not really winning a victory if you're not playing fairly. At least a fairly common question that I see down in the comments is concern as to whether cheating or poor sportsmanship is more common in tournament play, where at least in theory there's a bit more higher stakes than whether you win or lose a single game of 40k. There might be big prizes or podium spots on offer, and those sort of things can often bring the worst out in people. In my experience, I'd say that cheating and people being more unpleasant does tend to be a little bit more common in tournaments, though honestly really not a lot worse. The vast majority of people who have played in events tend to be really lovely people. I'd say on average I have around about 1 difficult game in 10. Even out of those, for the people who I feel haven't played very pleasantly, I'm not sure I've ever had a game that I think has truly been decided on whether or not the other person cheated. Every so often with big tournaments on the internet there are some high profile cases where people get called out, but I think that social media does tend to amplify the problem a bit. You tend to hear far more about the 1 or 2 bad games than the vast majority of games at the event that went smoothly. The majority of the really good tournament players tend to play very cleanly, being keen to avoid any potential backlash like this. So now we've talked a bit about cheating, let's maybe discuss a bit about confronting it if it does rear its head. First up, I would bear in mind that it might not even be worth it. If you're just playing a random pickup game in a casual setting, you could by all means just call a bit of attention to when the other player isn't playing fair, but at the end of the day we are generally playing this game for fun, not work or stress. Whether you win or lose any one game of Warhammer 40k isn't really the biggest deal, and if there's a good chance that you might not be playing the other person again, then you don't necessarily have to if you think that they don't play fair. If you do think that you're going to be playing them quite regularly though, it might just be worth addressing, and calling out errors, measuring wrong distances and the like, just to try and stop it becoming more of a problem down the line. In a more competitive or tournament setting, I'd certainly say that it is worth confronting cheaters. Generally I think that the people who cheat in tournaments generally really want to win. That's the whole reason that they're bothering to bend the rules and make the game unpleasant for other people. So I feel like backing down is kind of just playing into their own hands. It generally means if someone isn't playing fair in a tournament, then I'll try my absolute hardest to enforce a fair game and if possible try and beat them. Certainly doesn't always work out that way, but if and when it does, winning against someone who's displaying a lot of poor sportsmanship or is just plain trying to break the rules at every turn is really quite satisfying. So for the next few slides, let's talk about trying to beat someone who's trying to break the rules at every turn. Firstly, there's a certain amount of preparation that you can do before the actual game. Just in general, having a fairly decent knowledge of the armies in the game will always help. It's a lot easier to call out people's little mistakes if you know how the rules should be played in the first place. Obviously that's not the easiest though, with quite so much content in 40k right now. I'd generally be aware of the ways that people do like to cheat, which we've already covered in this video already. And before a game, I'd mentally try and steel yourself and get ready to have a game where you're going to need to be quite observant. fully understanding what's going on both with your own army and also with your opponent's forces as well, so you can spot anything that's not going quite right. A good pre-game discussion can certainly help clear up any areas of ambiguity. I'll most certainly talk through things like terrain rules, exactly how you're going to be using them in-game, and how they interact with both yours and your opponent's units. I'd quite carefully read through their army list, and don't be afraid to ask questions if there are certain units that you don't know what they do, and clarify the rules for their warlord traits and relics. I'd also talk about playing to intent, and whether they prefer to play quite a tight game rules-wise, or maybe being a bit more relaxed in terms of model placement, say things like measuring out 9 inches from deep strike, or being a bit more lenient with certain things like takebacks or sequencing errors. In-game, if you are expecting that your opponent might be about to give you a tough time, or if they do seem to be making a lot of repeated small errors that go in their favour, I would try and speak up quickly if you're not happy with a move, whether the measurement was just plain wrong, or whether they're using a rule that you strongly suspect doesn't work that way. If you don't challenge things that you're not happy with, you're not going to be able to go back and fix it several turns later, so it's either speak up or just forget about it. If they are the sort of person who's going to keep on trying to make these small misdemeanors, if you don't push back, it's likely to keep on happening. For rules that you're really not convinced about, you can always ask politely to check the codex, just to clarify and make sure that you're both on the same page. It might be them who's misinterpreting something, or it might be yourself that was misinformed. Either way, someone's going to learn something. Most of the time, FAQs tend to address more edge case things these days, but that can also be another potentially useful one to check. They are generally pretty speedy to download from Warhammer community. For things like movement errors, that's the sort of thing that you really do need to address in the moment, and it can be a bit annoying having to try and keep an eye on their movement phase if it does keep on happening. For absolutely crucial measurements such as really important charges, or whether or not something's just going to be in range or out of range, it can be worth pre-measuring things. Say at the top of the turn measuring the full distance between one very scary melee unit and your critical unit. Then you can be sure that between their movement and charges, you know exactly what number they should need to get in combat. If there is a rules disagreement, sometimes one of the fastest ways to resolve it could just be to ask a ref or tournament organizer at events. They usually have pretty decent game knowledge and can give a quick answer. In a casual setting, maybe just asking someone at the next table for an unbiased opinion can be a way to get things moving quite quickly as well. A few other things to be aware of are to try and keep an eye on the score each turn. Generally, I think in tournaments it's quite helpful to have both players keep the score. If you just let the other person do it, then you do put yourself at risk if you suspect that they might be a bit dodgy. If you're expecting that people aren't rolling dice quite fairly or are going a bit heavy on the measurements, just leaning over and making sure that they're aware that you're watching them when they're doing things can really discourage people from doing that sort of thing. And I'd make sure that people are clarifying their intentions before doing certain actions and things. Say if they roll a dice before declaring what it was for, it just happens to be a really good number, then they'd say it was for a really important roll. That could be one to look out for. And maybe making sure that stratagems are played at the right time in the turn. For example, some things need to be played at the start of a phase, so it wouldn't be allowed if they're trying to play it later after they've gained more information about what you're doing. I often find it's kind of helpful just to ask them if they want to use stratagems at the appropriate time before proceeding on and maybe getting into a disagreement. Say like rotate ion shields for Imperial Knights to give them a better invul save. I usually ask people if they want to do that when I'm about to start shooting at it, rather than after I've rolled all the dice and they know the exact amount of shots as to whether or not to bother. Finally, slow play does need addressing fairly early on in the game if you are expecting it. Often games of 40k do tend to speed up a bit towards the end, but if you're only on turn 1 and half your game time has already gone, I'd at least raise the possibility of timekeeping with your opponent early, and if they're still playing very slowly, it could just be worth mentioning to a tournament organizer to encourage their other player to speed up a bit. If you really think it's going to be a big issue, there's not really a lot that they can do after the game's already happened. So again, it's something that you really need to address at the time if you are concerned that it might be a problem. Finally, if you are at a tournament and you've had a bad game, usually the instincts are just to forget about it and the other person as soon as possible. But I'd try and make sure that you do your bit and make sure that the scores aren't distorted for the other players. I'd try and avoid conceding and giving your opponent a maximum win, as that's going to give them a far better chance of winning the event outright, and potentially rewarding their own bad behaviour, and make sure that the victory points are reported exactly as they happened. If you've had a really unpleasant experience, it could be worth just at least quietly mentioning it to a tournament organiser that the other player's really not playing nicely. It's not likely to change the outcome of your own game after it, but if they are hearing the same feedback from multiple different opponents about one player, it can give them a little bit more ammunition to try and do something about it for future events. So anyway, certainly not the most pleasant topic to cover in 40k, but I hope you've got a bit of value around talking about the subject of cheating. I certainly look forward to hearing any anecdotes down in the comments below, how you've handled difficult opponents, and whether or not that you might have done things differently in hindsight. I would still stress that it's really not a big problem for the hobby. People are far more likely to be making honest mistakes than cheating, and it only comes up in a very, very small amount of games. In any case, if you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I will try and keep these regular 40k discussion videos coming, with new content coming out pretty much every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying the videos and would like to help keep them coming, I would just like to mention that the channel has a Patreon page, which you can find down in the video description. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, such as seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next for the channel, and automatic entry into the channel's regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.